All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Simulation Century, a podcast slash video cast where we talk about some of the most important issues of the day, aligned with our thesis that we've had for the last 15 years that the last century was about the moving image. It was the first time in human history when we could commune around major events like the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Vietnam War, by looking at and reviewing video footage about it. And our friend and Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan would say, or did say, that the medium is the message, that the things we make us, and the media that we use to do that communion around major events changes us physiologically, sociologically, and psychologically. And what we say today is we have even more powerful media in the form of data-centric AI and simulation, where we can look at past events, current events through technologies like digital twins, and we can not only predict the future, but design the future that we want to make happen, and all that that portends. But my guest today is a good friend of mine, someone I've been following very closely over the last couple of years in our mutual involvement in the people-centered internet, which we'll talk about in a minute. Patrick Scannell is up in Virginia and has his new book, The Disruption of Thought, which we'll be talking about today. Why don't you just introduce yourself, Patrick?
Oh, hi. Well, first of all, this is the first podcast since the pub date has been announced. I really appreciate the forum. Thank you so much, and I think it's perfect for the nature of the work. So thanks. Yeah, so I'm a technologist who spent maybe 30 years in technology. A good bit of that was in telecom, but I was supposed to be the person who help the adjacent industries take advantage of emerging technologies in telecom. And so I've had a chance to play roles in some of the most seminal consumer technologies, the Kindle, mobile gaming, laptops, certainly smartphones, and then the adjacent platforms. But about 13 years ago, I had an exit where I was an early member of a sorry, my default speaker just changed. An early member of a technology company that was backed by Google. And after that exit, everybody went and bought new cars or got new jobs. And I had this niggling question in the back of my head that technology was affecting us, mostly because when I would drive down the road, having just launched a nationwide 4G network, I was watching people look at their phones as they drove. And I said, I wonder why we adopt technology the way we do and how does technology affect us. And I thought maybe I would take a few months sabbatical and read a few books. 13 years later, you find me here. I've got four manuscripts complete, one published next month, and another one coming out probably 9 to 12 months after that. And basically, I've spent the last 13 years chasing a set of research questions about how technology affects us, how we think affects how we adopt technology, how well technology serves us. You talk a lot about creating technologies that lead to a more flourishing future, and I say for a wider group of people. And frankly, these basic questions, I've got about 9 or 10 of them, have led to about 10 insights, one of which is this book, that thought is being disrupted. And it's been a crazy and confusing journey, but one would have thought that these questions, these basic questions, would have been answered. But we're also specialized these days that I'm surrounded by thousands of books that deal with one aspect of this or another, but not the core of how does technology affect us.
So, Patrick, you and I met through the people-centered internet with Vince Cerf, Maylene Fung, David Bray, all these great folks. And one of the folks that we commune, or the things we communed around, was the Clue Train Manifesto that came out right when the internet, at least the graphical internet, was first born. And you mentioned, David Weinberger.
Yeah,
Right?
I know quite well now.
But I love that philosophy, which persists through the people-centered internet, is how do we bend all of this technology towards benevolent outcomes, and how do we make it people-centered and not corporate-centric, or serving, like we have with social media, the needs of monetizing human attention and things like that? How do we use it instead to cure disease, help the planet, populate Mars potentially, all those sorts of things. But when did you first join the people-centered internet?
Well, David Bray has opened a lot of doors for me. So he brought me into People Centered Internet. He brought me into a couple of other think tanks that he has originated or is a part of, and I'm really grateful for him. Um, so that would have been maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I've been kind of quiet for the last three because I was working on the books. Also, I didn't want to be the guy who's like and subscribe and here's my new book. But the relationships I built through People Centered Internet were great and inspiring. The We talked briefly about Mark Prensky. The number of people who have contributed to technology but still have an optimistic outlook is inspiring. At the same time, I'm always questioning what kind of difference can we make? I mean, is it just feel good? Is it just talking to feel good about ourselves, or how can we actually? And I sense that you're questioning the same direction, but not yet convinced we're going to necessarily. One of the original gangsters of AI was in a small forum of top technologists, and he said, "I'm still not convinced whether AI is going to save us all or kill us." And when somebody at that level is still not convinced, it's important to surround yourself with optimists and people who are working hard. And that's what I found in People Centered Internet.
I think that's so important too, just to have really smart people who are not chasing the almighty dollar all the time, but really thinking through like what is the impact of this. And that's why I was drawn in college to Marshall McLuhan and folks that I've already mentioned there. And I went to one of the first singularity conferences, early, at least one of the early ones, not the first. But in 2010, I was in New York, and I remember the seismic impact of sitting there with David Chalmers and Ben Goertzel and everybody, and how they were really, we were having real salon-like conversations about what is the impact of AI going to be, and how fast is it going to be thrust upon us, and how do we prepare society for it? And we're still not prepared. But and let's get to your book. The idea of disrupting thought, I think, is really interesting. And when you first shared your book with me and I was reading it, I was thinking about William Gibson in a documentary he called, I don't know how many people have seen that. It was a very small documentary called No Maps for These Territories. But he had this great quote in there where he said, we're outsourcing our thinking. We're building these exocortical extensions of ourselves, and it really is having major societal impact. But it reminded me a lot of the thesis in your book. Can you just, for the audience here, just describe the thesis of disruption of thought?
Sure. So I create what I call a new-ish model of human thought, but really it's a synthesis of a lot of other people. Chalmers, Clark, lots of people have. Ben Houston coined the term exocortex. It's so funny. I could go down so many rat holes because I'm like, well, it's not just the cortex; it's the amygdala, it's the whole thing. But lots of people have done bits and pieces of this. But my model of thought is a greatly extended one. We all think that we think inside of our skull biologically, but in fact, even within our body, thinking occurs throughout our body. It's influenced by primarily senses and emotions that then surface up into conscious thought. And by the way, I don't focus on conscious or consciousness. I focus on thought, how the body makes sense of and the world around it and pursues the thing it wants to do. So when you follow the thread of thought, it quickly goes from biological to social and cultural. You and I are using words. We're actually using English words. We're making references to works of others. These are all social constructs, right? PCI is a social construct. Amazon is a social construct. Zoom is a social construct. So we have constructed a set of tools around us that allow us to think better. So think back to early language. The idea was you could store information in those around you. The difference is you needed to know how to extract it from them. And I'll explain that now as I switch to technological and cultural. So that's the third of the three streams of thinking is technological and cultural. And so my very first book, which may not be published for several years, looked at the evolution of cognition and technology in the primate species. And I know that sounds odd, but it goes from 60 million years ago to today. And my co-author there is one of the world's top chimpanzee cognitive neuroscientists. He's my age. I said to him, "Do you know your wife's phone number?" He goes, "Yes." I said, "Do you know your children's phone number?" He goes, "No." He goes, "It's
We've
here," and he
outsourced.
points to his
Yeah.
iPhone. And I said, "Is that thought?" He goes, "Absolutely." And I can't remember exactly who it is, but the comment is, "It is thought if it is being done by something that, if it was done in your brain, you would consider it thought." So
Yeah,
store,
storage and retrieval. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But the difference is you still need to know how to extract it. Let me stay with the primates for a minute. There's a piece I did on gorillas, and gorillas live in a world in which they eat the foods that nobody else eats, thistles and other stuff. But it's very difficult to extract that information. So they had to develop different parts of their brain than other primates to extract that. Now, if I was to ask you if you know what time it is, you would say yes, but then you would look at your watch. You didn't know what time it was, you knew how to extract it. And likewise, if you were to go into an LLM or into uh, an application and pull out something, you would have to know the steps to do the interface to extract it. So we're still thinking, but we have greatly scaffolded our thinking through these extensions. So that's the basic model. And again, I give full credit to lots of other people who've talked about this. But one thing I'll mention, I saw some framing questions you sent me. I don't think of this as bad or good, but it's different. And I go back to a historian of cognition, Merlin Donald, who points out that, in the advent of writing, following that is when we saw a blossoming of culture, civilization, even early days of science and new technologies. The idea was that by taking this expensive human process of thinking and storing, in this case, long term memory in physical things, which then could transport across time and distance, right? So we could scale information. You talk about how technologies compress this, but in this case, it was a scaling function. It unlocked extra resources in the brain that could be devoted to these higher functions. And the last thing I'll say there is I did a small TEDx talk back in 2017, and I finished it. Maybe this was my 2018 talk. I said, in just a few years, technology will be able to think better than you. What should you be thinking about then? And so that these are some of the things that I think about when I think about the book. But I sat down next to a relative just a couple weekends ago, and they said, "Okay, what's the bottom line of your book?" And I'm like, the bottom line of your book is that when we look at human cognition and thought and how we interact with technology, it doesn't lend itself to tweets and TikTok videos. We really had to do this broader map against which we can then carve off pieces.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot of, throughout your book, I was thinking about Engelbart, right, and his idea of, it's our symbols and our technologies and our, what was the other? It was symbols, technologies, and something else, but it had that triumvirate as well. But
Yeah.
that's how we package things up, and we think that's really how cognition does happen. Um, so interesting. So you have the three streams: the body, the culture, technology, and you describe it as a lossy process. So we're losing something, right?
Well, anytime you reduce something, um, you know, the contact in my phone is not my child, right? It's a representation of my child. It's a simulation. It's a very so lots of things are lossy. It's not a primary focus of my work, the lossiness, as much as the artificiality of the representation. The words on the page can travel. There's a term called manuport. I have a million-year-old stone tool around here, but a clay inscription with uh, dots and scratches on it can live 5,000 years. It can be carried hundreds of miles. That's great, but it's not the same thing as the the fields of corn that it represents. Baudrillard is where I go on this. He
Right.
talks about simulations in Smolcra, and he's like, you can carry a map around of a mountain around with you, but you can't carry the mountain. The difference is, and this is one of Ellul and Baudrillard's points, we've lost the ability to make the distinction there. And the way I drive this home in a way that relates to people, and I'll stop here, is Lord of the Flies. We all know the book. In fact, when I talk about this stuff, how technology is disrupting thought, everyone brings up this thin veneer of civilization under which we're all brutes. And they almost very regularly bring up Lord of the Flies. But very few people know that 16 months after that book came out, the book that we're all required to read, that's basically just got made into a movie, it's really well known, is this little smaller story of where it actually happened. Six teenage boys, excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
allergies right now.
Mm. Tis the
Six,
season.
six teenage boys got stuck on an island, Ata, for 12 months. And same thing, they had to build a fire, they had to, do, chores. They built a weight room, they built a guitar, they flourished. That's what life really is. Rosling has a book called Factfulness. It's the best book I've seen that bridges the gap between the abundance and optimists, and then the pessimists. That, hey, if you accurately understand the way the world is, if you're able to distinguish between the representations and what underlies them, and the biases that occur between them, the negativity biases, etc. So, long way of saying I'm less worried about lossiness as much as I'm worried about people's ability to lose the distinction between the representation and the reality. And it's not that the reality is great and the representation is bad. There's strengths and weaknesses of both, but you have to be able to understand the distinction. And I saw in some of your previous podcasts that you talked about that with simulations and AI, and so.
And I think, that as I was reading your book, I was thinking about that reductionism. Like, how do you, we're reducing things down. We have the lossy compression of reality, but then we add back things, and we do that also with simulation and with the technologies we're wielding. And that's the whole point of art and theater and everything else, is we're augmenting base reality with something that adds to the human experience of that base reality. So I think that's another thread we could always pull on. But coming back to the disruption part of this, and William Gibson in his, a lot of his discussions about, like, what have we lost, and he talks in that documentary about, there was a kind of music that was in Appalachia that had its own unique sound that you could only find in these, like, really base recordings back from the early 1900s. All of that's lost because as we started using technology and connecting more and more people together in the global village, there's a homogenization of how music sounds. And so we've lost something. We've lost those unique islands of thought patterns and experiences of reality, both reductionist and expansionist, that are very, very different. So what's happening now? Like, are we going to see that homogenization, in your opinion, of thought through AI, with if everything gets mediated? And I tried not to do that with this discussion. You'll see that I read your book and I have my questions and my thoughts that were only mediated through my brain, but I don't even know anymore because I'm using AI and I have been using machine learning and AI since 2010. How much of that is uniquely me and how much of it is mediated by the tools that we're using? And are we going to get that homogenization where everybody starts sounding and looking and thinking similarly?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me take a step back and look at the generational bias in this conversation as we try to answer it, because as Prensky focuses on, this younger generation, I have an adaptation of my work coming out. This is a generation that's growing up in the middle of technology. And again, I'm not a doom and gloom guy. I'm a what's going on guy. But within that generation, and my children, daughters are in college, they're overwhelmed by technology, but they're certainly leaning into AI. You and I and Mark have this huge base of experience through which we can push back on AI and say, hey, that list of 3 top thinkers is missing these 2. What was your rubric for this?
Mm.
Or, hey, what do you think of Pat's book? And have you considered it against, say,
Michael Pollan's book, as I
yeah,
did.
yeah, yeah, exactly. What are the connections between the Simulation Century book and this? What are the overlaps? But you've got training material, you've got talks, you've got texts, you've got your books, and so just in the you and I answering the question, while I'm not an expert on homogenization, I'm well aware of it. I'm certainly aware that it's much more likely to occur at those younger ages and globally than it is among people like you and I who've put a lot of thought into it, who are critical thinkers, who push back, maybe we're even opinionated, but there's a generational thing there. So that's the first thing I would say.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Um, I I'm less worried about homogenization, and therefore I'm less able to be of service to your question as I am to what would we do about it. And that leads me back to homogenization. So you've talked in some of your earlier talks, particularly the one that I saw with Jim, about solutions and government and DARPA backed. So a lot of people talk about this, and in fact, critics of technology, notably Zuboff and Harris, surveillance capitalism, and social dilemma, seem to me want the billionaires in Silicon Valley or the DC legislators to fix the problem. And you're talking about corporations and think tanks and other things. I I think in this world, the democratization of access to tools and the demonetization. I mean, look how cheap ChatGPT is. Um, Unlocks the opportunity for what people call new power. I look to enable a ground up set of solutions, and I start first and foremost with what is it that we want to value in this new world. I talk about technology as a magic wand. It can give you anything you want, but if you go into it saying, I want to use ChatGPT to help my education, and you pursue the same educational goals that you would have done 6 years ago, you're missing the point. You can leapfrog. But if you fall prey to running with the crowd, homogenization, you're giving up your opportunity to leapfrog. So I think less about homogenization and more about the opportunity that we all have to use this powerful magic wand, which could backfire, to ask for new things. If you'd asked me 20 years ago what my goal is, I wouldn't have said widespread human flourishing unless I was running for Mr. America or something. But now that's actually my goal because it's I can see a line of sight to it. It's not about getting Instagram followers. It's not about getting a vice president position. 10 years ago, that's what I would have been. Well, 15 years ago, that's what I would have thought I would have been at this point, an EVP at a tech company. But my goals have shifted, and I'm less concerned about material things. I'm wary of the goals that the world would have us pursue. And I'm much more interested, not for higher reasons, but because it satisfies me more. I am more balanced, more centered, more happy pursuing almost impossible new goals of widespread human flourishing. And I'm doing it in baby steps, conversations with people like Jim, with conversations like with Vint and you and Mark and so many people that we would find in places like PCI. But PCI wouldn't exist unless we had the internet to bring us all together. So PCI is a perfect example where you don't have homogenization. The question is how do we unlock that for the younger generations? That's the part that I struggle with because there's so much virality that drives the perceived values of fear of missing out there.